Thank you.
All right, thank you. Hihani washte, hamatakiape, wambli watakpi anichiapi. My name is Sherman, and I'm doing a quick little demo. So we're just gonna make a little bit of a quick dish. So I've got some venison loin right here, and I'm just searing it off. I had the chef team back here create a few of these pieces. You guys are gonna be getting a sampling of this in just a little bit. So I went out and gathered some, there were some pine trees sprouting, and they have these beautiful little pine sprouts, and they're so tasty right now because they're so tender. Even these little needles, they look dangerous, but they're actually pretty good for you. I also have some cranberries just going straight in here with a little bit of water and a touch of maple. And I'm just going to make a really super simple dish, and it's just going to take a couple of minutes, and it's just to show you guys how quick and fun and easy it is, and always being on the lookout for what's around you outside and what you can use on your plate. And we're going to make a pretty little plate in just a second. So we'll get these guys nice and medium rare. And I use for a seasoning, I just used a little bit of sumac, salt, and maple sugar, and just made a little seasoning mix out of those pieces. So if you guys drive around this area and you look around, you're going to see nothing but staghorn sumac all over the place. And it's not ready yet right now, but you can't miss them because they have those little fronds. They're really dark right now, but they'll turn red. And it's just a great seasoning spice. And I also have some mustard greens, just because in my yard I basically just have a mustard green patch, it looks like. So I'm just growing lots of garlic mustard for some reason. But yeah, it's just everything's popping up in season right now. There's nettles out there, there's fiddleheads, there's ramps out there. All the conifers are sprouting. All the trees were just blossoming. They're just getting past barely. So you see all the apples and plums and cherries and everything like that. Choke cherries, and there's just so much cool stuff out there. And it's just a great time of year because, and plus we just got done mapling a while ago now, but we were able to tap some box elder, some maple, some birch, some black walnut, and get those all down into syrups and some of them into sugars. And it's just so good. This is my favorite time of year just because we live in the north, unless you're from further north than us, but it feels very north to us. But it's felt like it's such a long winter because I know it was just so cold, but it felt like it really went on for like 18 months. And I was really happy when spring finally showed up because we just miss all this wonderful food out there. And we did have a really good time this winter. We played around with some tasting menus, and we were able to kind of do elevated modern indigenous foods for the entire winter. And it was a lot of fun to see the creativity that our staff was able to come up with and just all the amazing foods that were out there. So this cranberry sauce has been cooking for only like 5 minutes, and it's already almost in sauce form. And you can use a hand blender if you want to, but a whisk, just as soon as those berries start to break, it just turns into such a great sauce. And the cranberries have such awesome pectin that it just thickens up so quickly. So you don't need the cornstarch slurries or any of that kind of stuff in there. And then this steak is done. And then also I just had them roast off a sweet potato whole. So we just cooked these for about 325 for probably about 40 minutes until they're fork tender. And I'm just going to make some rounds out of these pieces. And we're going to build a pretty little plate. And then we're going to jump right into my presentation and talk about indigenous foods in general. I don't know how well you guys can see on the camera, but this is perfectly medium rare right here. And again, the chefs are preparing a little space for you guys to eat this stuff. I'm just going to saute these guys up just a tiny bit, these little spruce sprout or pine sprouts, because they don't need very much. And I'm just going to quickly chop up some of this green. is these greens, especially the mustardy greens, they just add so much awesome flavor to everything. And you don't really need that much. And this is just going to give these guys a little bit of that flavor. I'm just going to put them around this also. And just a little bit of these berries. And voila. You can see it? I can't see what's on the screen. All right, so I'm going to just jump right into my presentation because I know that we're a little bit behind schedule today, but I just really wanted to talk with you guys and do what I do. So I've done this talk quite a bit over the past few years, and I keep growing it a little bit. I change it a little bit. I usually like to talk, try to make it relevant to whatever region we might be in. But before pandemic, I was probably traveling to about 26 states a year doing this presentation in quite a few countries, and it's been a lot. So I haven't had a lot of travel over the past couple of years, but this year it's starting. And I'm really excited about it because the timing is right. Like, we still have a lot of work to do. We just got through this major pandemic, and restaurants, who knew that all restaurants would just completely collapse on themselves, right as that pandemic started. So for us, when we were getting ready to officially launch the space where our Indigenous food lab is in South Minneapolis, we had found this wonderful multi-ethnic food hall called the Midtown Global Market, and we found all these wonderful spaces to move in there. And I remember we moved in there in mid-January, and then we were working with all of our lawyers and getting all the leases drafted, and we were about ready to sign at the end of February, and then I went down to Mexico for a quick second, and then while I was down there, the whole pandemic just unfolded at that beginning part of March that year. And then so when we got back, we decided not to sign a lease. We decided it was a really bad time to open up a restaurant at that very moment. And we just kind of held steady for a second like everybody did. And then I felt like a month and a half to 2 months because we were kind of shutting everything down through March, and then we kind of sat fast in April and May. And then at the end of May, the George Floyd incident happened here in Minneapolis. And everywhere around the Indigenous Food Lab where we were just got completely destroyed because it's right on Lake Street. So all the buildings around us were completely burned down to the ground. And then so we just got our little team back together. I think there was only 8 of us, and we just started doing food relief. So we were doing 400 healthy Indigenous meals a day, trying to get those foods mostly out to the homeless encampments that exploded that summer. And we did that throughout the whole summer. And then as the winter came along, we started sending healthy foods to 9 out of the 11 tribes across Minnesota, and we're sending 10,000 meals a week with a staff of probably less than 15 people, and we used a lot of volunteers. So it was pretty intense. And then as that winter led up, as that winter led up, and Owamni was on the horizon. The park board was really anxious to get that space open. So we are, the Minneapolis Park Board are basically our landlords there at Owamni, but we had to come up with, a lot of capital to get a restaurant launched during a time period where no banks were even touching restaurants. They said, the banks told us that they weren't going to fund anything until the entire country was 70% vaccinated, which we know will probably never happen anyways, right? So it was really tricky to navigate through all that stuff to get us launched, So we finally got it all together. We launched Owamni in last year in July, and we've been sold out every single night since we've been open, and it's been a wild ride. And it's just been such a unique space. We've been in so much press, and we're so grateful for the space. The restaurant sits right on a really sacred spot, too, because it's right where the waterfall used to be downtown Minneapolis, or what is downtown Minneapolis. And the Lakota called it Owamni, which meant place of the falling, swirling water. And it was just a really sacred place. And there was a Lakota village on the side of the river that our restaurant's on for so many years, or generations. And it was a place where people could portage. There was a lot of trading going on. And we took the short name of that space, which is just Owamni, because Owamni is kind of a mouthful, but people would just say Owamni. And so we just kind of reclaimed the name of where we were, which is really cool, which was the heart of what became downtown Minneapolis. So it's a really special place for us, and we feel very lucky that we were able to finally get there after so many years of dreaming it and working towards it, that now it's open and now it's running, and we are able to have a place where you can come in and you see native food, you see native language, you hear native music, you see native staff, and it just fills all of those pieces, you know. So, and we're so unique, but we have the need for getting all of these restaurants out there. Like, we need to be able to find these native restaurants in every single region so we can showcase and celebrate our diversities, you know, as Indigenous peoples. And we can get there, you know, it's going to happen. And we're just, for us, the restaurant is just a showpiece. It's just, you know, where it's just showing us what's possible, that we can have a really intentional, decolonized focused restaurant concept, and it can be extremely popular, and we can feel good about it when we get there, you know. And we can have different scales of restaurants. We can have low-end restaurants, we can have high-end restaurants, but we just need more Indigenous food operations out there. So I'll talk through my quick story a little bit. It's not quick, but it's a story that I give all the time. So for myself, I was born on Pine Ridge in South Dakota, so I'm enrolled with the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe. And you know, that was just my hometown there, my homegrown area. So we grew up feral kids out in the plains, and we had chased dogs around. I was teasing my dad the other day because somebody was saying, we were talking about pronouns, and one of the older managers was saying, "Oh, I can never remember the pronoun thing. It's hard for me." He said, "Sorry, I was raised by boomers." I was like, "Boomers didn't really raise us. They just made us go outside until it got dark." And that was pretty much the way they did it, you know. So I just remember my parents would see us running out the door with a bunch of 22s and like, "Where are you going?" Like, "We're going down to the dump to shoot stuff." And they'd be like, "Well, bring the dogs at least," you know. So that was quality parenting on Pine Ridge in the 70s. And I remember another one. This is a funny one too, because I remember it was like 4th of July and we had a whole bunch of fireworks, and we were a little pack of kids in Pine Ridge. And then we needed the little punks to light them, but my parents were too cheap to buy the punks because they were just an extra $1 or something like that. So they're like, "Here, just take some cigarettes." So they gave us a whole bunch of cigarettes and lit one and say, "Don't let this one go out. When that one goes out, light the next one." So we were walking down the street with a whole bunch of fireworks and a pack of cigarettes because that's what our parents told us to do. Another classic example of parenting on Pine Ridge in the 70s. Anyways, so, so I worked, my mom moved us off the res right before I started high school, and I started working in restaurants and right away. And it was great because I was around food and it was warm, and I just had a good work ethic. So I worked really hard very young, and I worked restaurants all through high school, all through college, and after college I moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And you know, I kind of got to a point in my career where after I'd been studying so many foods from around the world, I realized the complete absence of Indigenous foods out there, you know. And it was eye-opening for me because I could name hundreds of European recipes easily off the top of my head, even naming them in those languages. Like, I was able to name, like I could say the recipes in Spanish or French or whatever, you know. So I knew all these European recipes, and I really realized that I knew very little about Lakota recipes, you know, and I had just a few in my mind that I could name, and that for me was eye-opening. I remember talking to my mom again too, and be like, "Do you have you ever seen any cookbooks on Pine Ridge, or, you know, Lakota cookbooks? Has anybody written anything down with all this stuff?" And then she's like, "Yeah, I've got one." So she gives me this cookbook on Pine Ridge food, and it was literally like a Lutheran cookbook, you know, because it was just like all the greatest hits of things, and it's just like, that's not what I'm looking for, because I'm trying to find Lakota food that doesn't have cream of mushroom soup in it, or, you know, blocks of American cheese and things. So I had a very specific, you know, I was really curious. What were my ancestors eating? What were they harvesting? How were they storing foods? What were they using for salts and fats and sugars? And just trying to understand and identify Indigenous foods. So it just set me on this journey of doing that, you know. And right out of high school, when I was in the Black Hills in South Dakota, I worked for the Forest Service. And what part of my job was to learn and name and identify all the plants in the northern Black Hills so I could write them down as a surveyor. And that skill set really helped as a chef later, because I knew that there was so many plants out there that had so much possibility responsibility. And I knew that my Lakota ancestors, for example, had that education of what to do with all these amazing plants, whether it's food, medicine, crafting, and everything. And, you know, so I just started reading all this history because I know that no matter where we are in North America, like all history begins with Indigenous history, and we have to remember that because our education system completely removes us as Indigenous peoples from the history books when you really think about it, you know. It just makes us look like something that just kind of happened and was kind of an annoyance to colonialism almost a little bit. And then so it's just trying to understand, like, why are we so invisible as Indigenous peoples, and why aren't our foods so prominent, even though foods from the Americas are really literally like the main bases in almost everything out there, you know? So identifying what were pre-colonial foods, I always start here because the best way to figure out what are pre-colonial foods is to understand the term colonialism, and the easiest way to understand the term colonialism is to just Google it. So if you Google the term colonialism, it's the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically, which again is not normal or not unique to just North America, but it's happened all over the globe. And we look at Indigenous knowledge as a global situation, you know, so we're looking at everything through a pan-Indigenous perspective because we're Indigenous peoples across the whole globe. North America, South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, you name it. There's peoples that we need to protect and steward Indigenous peoples, cultures, diversities, and food systems everywhere we are. So not just us, but we can start here. Because we all have a common situation. Like, you know, we're all battling white supremacy that's held us down for generations. And we've just been living through centuries of racism and white supremacy, and it's only getting worse because white supremacy does not like being dismantled, as you can tell with just the political state and the divisiveness of things out there right now. Like, people are literally getting in trouble and getting fined for just teaching histories right now, you know? And it's a dangerous time when you can get, like, thrown behind bars for teaching your own histories, which is something that a lot of our ancestors dealt with, especially at the turn of the century. And, you know, people forget, too, that in North America, that Indigenous peoples were also heavily part of the slave trade. There was 5.5 million Indigenous peoples enslaved during the time period of 1500 to 1900. You know, and they bring 12.5 million Indigenous African people over to these continents, but also at the same time, they enslaved a lot of the Indigenous peoples, especially on the East Coast and with the Spanish and Mexico in the South and the West area. But, you know, we still see that slave trade active up until the turn of the century, and literally it's still kind of out there right now, especially with the sex trades and things out there. People are literally enslaved still today. So we haven't gotten much better, and we always have to remember how young our country is, because the United States, you know, in the year 1800, we're not much more than the 13 colonies that we started with. Ohio was the western frontier at that time period. We're still at war with Great Britain, and we're still just kind of a mess, you know, and we're just, you know, the United States is being run by a very renegade and racist government, and it sets the tone for how it treats Indigenous peoples for the rest of that entire century, you know, because the reality of what's going on out there is all land spaces, even though they're being divvied up by colonial powers, that they're still stewarded by our Indigenous families and communities all over the place. And a lot of these communities haven't even seen European people at that point in history yet. And we don't even see the United States form its own colonial borders until the middle of that century, until like around 1847 or 1853, when it's somewhere right there. But, you know, but then we just go through all of this situation. Oops, that slide's out of sync, but we just have to remember like how fast that land gets taken from us, you know, as Indigenous peoples, because the United States government learned early on by removing Indigenous peoples and taking over their land spaces, they could commodify those land spaces and just make a ton of money, and the United States does make a ton of money off of that. On top of that, using slave labor from Indigenous African and just Indigenous peoples to build all of this stuff out there. And it's just, you know, it's a really intense history. There's so much forced removal. There's so much just genocide actively happening here in Minnesota. There was a bounty system. California had a bounty system, and where people can get paid up to $200 for the body part of an Indigenous person. If you do the inflation of what is $200 back in the 1850s, 1860s, like it's an immense amount of money, and it was all state-sponsored and then government paid back. So our government sponsored all of this genocide, and it's important to know these histories. The Treaty of Guadalupe I knew that slide was out of whack. It was 1848. But we also just see all of these things through Congress during that time period with the Homestead Act of 1862, the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871, the Dawes Act of 1887. All of these major acts of Congress continuously stripping power from Indigenous peoples and stripping everything, you know, and making and just taking more and more and more land spaces and making the U.S. government more and more rich. If you guys ever want to study more of that, I suggest you really read up about the Morrill Act, M-O-R-R-I-L, and understand how the land-grant universities are actually built and what's going on with that. That's a whole other presentation and story, though. So during this time period, we see a lot of we lose so much access to our own environment, to our own indigenous foodways. Our entire area just completely changes, you know, with the full colonial machine in full effect. We see entire forests just being ripped down. You know, can you imagine like what our forests would look like with just massive old growth forests everywhere, and just like what that site would have been like, and especially for areas where indigenous peoples had been stewarding those areas for so long and how clean they kept them, and you know there was entire like roadways built through the forests for people to move things around, and like there's been such an amazing sight just to learn from indigenous communities to see what was actually happening in all regions across the whole area. But we also see an immense amount of destruction of crops and seeds, and it starts from our very first president, George Washington. So right after he's president, he sets his sights on the tribal communities in the Northeast, and he orders his General Sullivan to completely wipe out and destroy. His orders are the total destruction and devastation of all settlements. So General Sullivan sets out in 1779, and does that exact same thing. So over a single summer, he just takes out all tribes, wiping out entire villages, like huge farm operations. They're, you know, being reported of like 6 mile by 6 mile fields of just agriculture going on, just so much immense and advanced agriculture that those tribes were utilizing back then. And still today, like George Washington is still known in Haudenosaunee as Town Destroyer, as the name for U.S. president. And we just see this aggression happen all the way across the entire 1800s. You know, this is a sign right before the Sand Creek Massacre, promising anybody who signs up for this, you know, to be a part of these ambushes, that they'll be able to like take home whatever they want, that they can just, after they kill everybody, then they can take whatever they want. And that was the promise of getting, and the enticement of getting people to sign up for these massacres. And here in Minnesota, we have a really dark history too, with the Dakota trying to stand up for their way of life, and then eventually being defeated harshly. A lot of them escape into the Dakotas, and a lot of them were rounded up here into Minnesota, where they're put on a concentration camp in Fort Snelling, and then eventually both the Dakota and Ho-Chunk, who had nothing to even do with the Dakota War, get kicked out. So they passed the Dakota and Ho-Chunk or Winnebago Expulsion Acts in 1863, basically making it illegal to be either of those two groups in Minnesota during that time period, which is an act that's passed through Congress, which becomes a law, which is probably still on the books, making it probably still illegal today to be Dakota or Winnebago in the confines of the state of Minnesota still. So my grandparents, I have come from Crow Creek, so when they kicked everybody out, they put them on riverboats, forced them down the Mississippi River to where the Missouri River meets, forced them up the Missouri River, dropped off in the middle of South Dakota, trained out to the newly formed Crow Creek Reservation. And so I have a lot of family that comes from that particular space right there. And almost a third of everybody who went on those boat rides died because it was a really bad environment, and a lot of people got sick, and a lot of people just didn't make it. And that's just part of the way we have to remember like what was going on, you know, where we are. We also lose a lot of bison. I did a lot of research studying what Congress was saying about bison and indigenous peoples, and they had full arguments of whether they should just completely annihilate and wipe out all tribes, or if they should do alternative things. And one of the things they came up with was destroying all of the bison. So the United States government sponsored the slaughter of millions and hundreds of millions of bison in the 1860s and 1870s. And there's little reports like this across history saying like there was just hunting parties all over the place, just wiping out as many bison as absolutely possible, getting paid for proof of those deaths, usually by tongue, and then these animals are just completely annihilated off the face of the earth. And this history is really dark because the sole purpose of slaughtering that animal was to weaken all the indigenous communities that were utilizing this animal so much for so many things. So we see, as Indigenous peoples, what we lost the most was just the loss of our own education systems, because, we all have education. We didn't have to have Western colonizers teach us what education is, because we carried education with us. Our education was just different, because our education was just our thousands of generations of our elders passing down knowledge to us of how to live sustainably, utilizing primarily plant knowledge when it comes down to it, and how to just live with what's around us and how to connect in all of our stories, our language, our songs, our art, our dances, our prayers, everything. Like, that was our education system, I know a story about when Lewis and Clark were starting to run out of food and they hadn't crossed the Rockies yet, and they had to ban their own crew members from harvesting any carrot-like vegetables because they didn't know what to look for, and they kept making themselves sick by grabbing the wrong roots, right? But they were able to allow Sacagawea to harvest as much as she wanted, even though she was only 16 years old. So this 16-year-old girl had better survival knowledge out there than all of these people who are supposed to be highly educated and evolved, And I think that's just a showcase of, because we're from these lands, we just know better when it comes down to what's around us. But instead, we're forced through the assimilation efforts of the United States government, and we should have been downloading, my grandparents' generation, a lot of your grandparents' generation should have been downloading all of that Indigenous education, Because I made the realization early on when I was doing this that, how far back did my ancestors still retain 100% of their Indigenous knowledge base? And it was less than 100 years ago, really. Because, I was born in 1974, and in 1874, my Lakota ancestors were still living as Lakota people, because they don't discover gold in the Black Hills until 1876. So it was less than a century from my birth that my Lakota ancestors still retained 100% retention of all of their Indigenous education. And so we can start to reclaim that today, because we have to look at all the harsh treatments that our grandparents' generations had to go through at the turn of the century. And we're just now learning, especially with the big report that came out on boarding schools, what was kind of just a glimpse of starting to understand what was going on out there and during that time period. And just the harsh treatments that all these kids had to go through. Like, our grandparents had to our great-grandparents had to worry if their kids would even come back alive, during those time periods. And we just see so many boarding schools out there, and we're learning about more, and we're just learning about how awful those situations were. And we can never forget that, because this is a huge point of where trauma comes into our lives and our families. And it's where we lose so much of our own education and our own knowledge base around our own foodways, And this happens all over the place, and Canada's been working on it a little bit longer, just barely. So I remember a couple of years ago, I think this is from 2018, but they did a ceremony in Ottawa where they tried to find as many names that they could and write them all down on a banner and then do a ceremony for them. So this ceremony I'm going to play, and it's just look at the banner and just think about all these names, and also know that this was before they started searching some of the grounds around those residential schools and finding hundreds of unmarked graves, and just knowing that this banner has so many more names that should be on here. But I think it's good to take a moment and just think about all of the children who just didn't make it through the system. Oops, sorry, that didn't work. Playing on my screen, but not the main screen. Okay. Oh, because I'm clicking on the wrong one. So I'm sorry that didn't work out, but I just think it's really important to take that moment, and I like to just have a moment of silence when we do that, just because it's just so many names. That banner goes on for an entire minute. I have no idea how long it is, but it just goes on and on and on. And knowing that's probably barely a tenth of the names that should be on that list anyways. So we just have to remember, that traumatic time in history that's not very long ago. So I like to look at the 1900s too, to see how we've done. And the 1900s were just as harsh for us as Indigenous peoples because my grandparents were born before they were citizens. That doesn't happen until 1924 for Indigenous peoples across the United States. Throughout the 1940s and 1960s, we go through an intense two decades of Indian termination and relocation policies, which creates large urban native populations in cities like Minneapolis, Oakland, Denver, Chicago. And it's just, again, really intense. And then we have the Indian adoption era from 1941 to 1967. And I feel like more people should talk about this one, because this one, to me, was really alarming when I discovered it. But the statistic is 1 out of 3 Native children are separated from their families during those 2 decades. And that's an intense number. Like 1 out of 3 Native children are put into adoption services and then put into non-Native families to further strip our cultures as Indigenous peoples. And you know, that's just really intense, and I'm sure a lot of us know people who have gone through those adoption services as Indigenous peoples and have such a hard time reconnecting to where they came from originally, you know, if they're able to find out. We're not able to vote until 1965. We can't celebrate our religions openly until 1978, you know, and that's well within my lifetime. And even on South Dakota, I know that South Dakota government wouldn't allow votes from unorganized counties, which meant Native counties, up until the 80s, you know. So this is all very recent stuff, you know. So we haven't even had time to, like, catch a breath, let alone open up restaurants all over the place, you know. So we have to give ourselves some time to understand what we went through, and then we give ourselves some time to understand how do we move forward. So how are we doing in post-colonial Native America? We've actually never reached an end of colonialism, you know. Indigenous peoples are still being wiped off the face of the earth in Brazil right now today, and there's still a lot of aggression out there against Indigenous peoples. I know that people are challenging Native treaty rights out there today, and there's all sorts of stuff happening that we have to be very aware of and together about. Like we're going to be stronger together, so we have to be very aware of those issues out there. Thank you. And it just hasn't gotten any better. I mean, because if you guys remember this was just from the last vote, you know. So this is how far we've gotten. So we have a ways to go. And we can just do better with our food systems, you know, and I know that there's a lot of work going into the USDA. There's a lot of changes that are being talked about, but I had to grow up with commodity foods, and like I have a lot of just, you know, not some of my favorite memories with commodity foods growing up. I remember living, you know, so far out in the country when we were kids, and we'd get picked up by this big 4x4 Suburban as our school bus, and we'd always be the last kids to get to school, and when we got there, we were forced to eat a bowl of cereal with powdered milk and shoot a little paper cup of juice that was just room temperature. And usually the choices were either tomato, apple, or orange. But because then we were always the last kids, it was only room temperature tomato juice on that table for us. And so that was, and they didn't even serve us vodka. So that was teased. That was a joke. That was a joke. Sorry. But maybe they did. But anyways, you know, it's just like growing up with that, you know, that's dinner when you're just eating all this overly processed, overly salted, overly sugared foods as a kid. And it's a direct correlation of our nutritional source of why we suffer from so much food illness. And it's happening, we're putting all this food in our own mouth, you know, and we just need better access to our foods, you know. And I always tease, like, we didn't even have those colorful cans growing up. We just had these things, you know, and it's the beef with juices and salmon with juices and pork with juices, and it's really with juices that sells those things. But so we can just do better. And you know, and this one piece, we all love it. I grew up with it. You know, when I started asking my elders on Pine Ridge, when did they remember Indian tacos even come into Pine Ridge? They all said they don't remember until the late 60s, early 70s was the first memory of them having it coming up. So this is not a traditional food, you know. It's fun. We've adopted it. You know, it makes us feel good to see it, not to eat it. And it tastes good, of course. But we could do better, because this shouldn't identify all of us as Indigenous peoples from all of our diversities. We can do better. Like, this isn't a good representation of us. You know, we have so much cooler foods out there. You know, who would much rather be eating venison backstrap with pine shoots and cranberries, right? So So this is where we are with understanding our indigenous food systems, and it's an understanding of diversity. That's what makes us unique as indigenous peoples from across the globe, is our diversities. So you can understand like the ecoregions first, just because of North America or pick a continent, there's so much amazing diversity out there. So you just start to understand like what grows, the climate zones, all the things, all the different animals that are out there. And, for me, like, I just really wanted to understand, again, like, what were my ancestors eating? And I started with just my ancestors, but as I started studying more groups, I started seeing it bigger and bigger. So it was really important to take that pan-indigenous perspective, because we need to work together. Like, that's the only way things are going to work. And we also need to realize that all people of color, all BIPOC, all Black, Indigenous, all people of color, we're all fighting the same fight. And we all share these same colonial stories of white supremacy, trying to dismantle our cultures, and we need to turn that around, and we can do that through food. Just by reclaiming our own foods and starting to reclaim our own cultures, we can build back what was stripped from us, and we can do it effectively. So because when you look at the diversity of indigenous peoples, like there's just no comparison to the colonial borders of how they try to divide us up. It's like saying this is Canada, this is the U.S., this is Mexico, but we are so diverse. And even within all of those language groups, there are so many different like dialects and other languages and other groups out there. Like we're just so diverse, and we're adaptable. There's 634 tribes in Canada, 576, I believe, in the U.S. right now. 20% of Mexico identifies as indigenous, and there's just no comparison. And it doesn't matter who speaks French or Spanish or English. Those are foreign languages, Those are European colonial languages. We should really be focused on the lands that we are on and pay respect to the peoples who are still here and the struggles that they all went through, And so it's up to us to reclaim this. It's up to us to understand and identify what is our education. How can we reclaim our education and make that the important part of our curriculums as we move forward, especially amongst our indigenous communities? We should not be just focused on what the government's telling us to teach ourselves, because look where that's gotten us, where we can do much better. Like our education is complex. Our education teaches us how to live as society. Our education teaches us how to understand the connection and the correlation of the world around us, the plants, the animals, and have the respect that go back into that and bring all of that diversity onto our plates and into our bodies, So, our knowledge, our education base is all of this: wild foods, permaculture, agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, oceanography, hunting, fishing, butchery, mycology, salt, sugar, fat productions, crafting, land stewardship, cooking techniques, metallurgy, histories, traditional medicines, food preservation and fermentations, nutrition, health, spirituality, and more. Like our education is extremely complex, and we should be focused on indigenous education. And again, like we can find the correlation as indigenous peoples across the globe, because we all had that connection to where we were and what our ancestors had passed down and how we lived so naturally for so many millennia and generations, So going through quickly just some of the foods. Proteins are an easy piece to understand, because literally any animal out there moving around can be food when it comes down to it. And people shouldn't be afraid of animals if they don't happen to be a cow, a pig, or a chicken. Our education does teach us about how Native Americans lump summing us all into one group, how we all used all parts of the bison. But that's just a study of how we are actually just resourceful, because we just knew that everything had a purpose, and we figured out what to do with all of our pieces, because we didn't have the privilege to be wasteful like we are today, where we literally buy something and throw it away moments later. We are so wasteful. We're just creating so much trash out there, where our ancestors didn't have to do that. Like they just knew what to do with everything, and they understood byproducts for both proteins and plants, and we can work back towards those education pieces. And again, be aware of the world around us, and there's like so much food out there. And again, we should just be really open and not just be supporting blindly beef, chicken, and pork industries. I support indigenous grown proteins, but I just really want us to think about alternative protein choices out there too. And proteins don't need to be the biggest part of our diet. We can have alternative. I went on a plant-based diet last year, and I felt great from that situation. And at the restaurant, I'm probably selling about 15 pounds of crickets. Who had crickets at Owamni last night? So I mean, they're popular, and it should be. Like, it's just getting it out there and just making it a choice for people to try, and it's good protein. But really, when it comes to it, it's the world around us. It's plants. That's the power that we can have by understanding what to do with all of this wonderful world around us, Because when we open up our eyes and stop calling everything a weed and take the time to identify, learn the names, learn the indigenous names of the plants around us, then we can start to see so much food and medicine constantly around us. It's always there, Understanding what kind of things are, like what needs we had as indigenous peoples, what kind of carbohydrates did we utilize, like the prairie turnip, the timpsila that we grew up harvesting as kids, or the camas root if you're in, the western side of the states, or around here where the wild rice is such an amazing, true piece, that just gives us so much nutrition, And it's so important that we protect those pieces, which is why we need to support each other when we're trying to battle and stand up against big oil, which is such a losing fight most of the time. But again, if we bind together, like, we can do it, It's really possible. And just understanding how much knowledge our ancestors had with all plants, whether they're water plants or on land plants or whatever, and that we've just been utilizing all of that. And I always like to tease, like, if you're in the desert where all the plants look like they want to hurt you or maim you, our ancestors knew very well what these plants were. And it's almost silly to use the term food desert, because if you're from the desert areas, you see nothing but food around you. It's everywhere. You just have to see it, And, we need to protect our own agriculture and understand the importance and the contributions that indigenous peoples have had to agriculture across the globe, because we're led to think that we're kind of at the epitome of what modern day agriculture is. But we know, like, the amount of chemicals that it takes to maintain that, and what that monocrop style is doing to all of our soils and taking away all the nutrients. Soil health is so important, We need to understand how our ancestors used diverse growing techniques in situations to make sure that the soil was healthy, and we're very aware of that situation, and we should just be really careful, because, like, if we see things like this on the internet, like, and those dangerous chemicals getting into our food, it's so hard to avoid those chemicals, because it's in everything. It's like everything in the middle of the grocery store. It's in all the corn, the soy, the beans, the rice. It's everywhere, and it's so hard to keep away from. But we just have to realize how much contribution indigenous peoples had with agriculture. If you've ever been down to the Yucatan and studied on Mayan civilizations, like, there's still a million Mayan speakers down there in the Yucatan. There's a lot of people, right? And they had amazing agricultural systems where they didn't even have any open water. Everything was in the cenotes, and they figured out how to support a massive civilization. And the same with the Nahuatl and the Aztecs. They had wonderful, highly organic growing systems, and they fed hundreds of thousands of people. And we can still get that. We can still work towards that. And they're growing things like corns and beans and squash and chilies and sunflower and cotton and all these things. And you can trace that migration northwards. Here's a Zuni farm with the waffle system. There's a Three Sisters mountain system from the East Coast. If you guys ever read Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden, I always tell people to read that book, because it's such a special look on indigenous agriculture, especially coming from a female indigenous voice, which never makes it through history ever. It's such a special piece. And just understanding that it's up to us to steward all of this food. I mean, we have to do it. Like, nobody else is going to do it. It's our job to make sure that these seeds stay in the hands of indigenous peoples, and that their stories maintained, because they're our stories. They come from very specific land spaces and peoples, and we have to make sure that they stay in those hands, and we protect those rights of indigenous peoples to carry those seeds forward into the future, and protecting, again, all of that amazing diversity that's out there, the best that we can. So for us, like, how do we move forward? Like, taking all of that knowledge and how do we do that? How do we walk forward, and how do we, keep that with us? So as we move through with business in the modern world, knowing that we are walking in a capitalistic world, we have to walk into two lanes. We're trying to carry our indigenous values with us, at the same time trying to survive and trying to, have a place in the world that we are today. So it's understanding all of those pieces to be able to move forward. How do we pay homage to our indigenous ancestors in meaningful ways that they would be proud of, How do we answer those prayers? And those are the questions we have to ask ourselves as we move forward, And part of this is just connecting with nature. That's what they would want. They would want us to know the names of everything out there. They would want us to know how to take care of all of these relatives that are around us, And we have to start doing that. We have to take the time to start to learn, to start to see food, to start to see medicine, to start to truly understand what a close relationship we do have with Mother Earth as we move forward, and to understand how to make this fun, because cooking can be really fun, to be able to harvest things, to dry things, to make all these seasonings and spices and make food taste like wherever we might be, and just getting out there and trying things. Like I probably try way too many plants out there just because I'm always curious, and sometimes I probably shouldn't put some things in my mouth, but everything's edible once, they say. So but as chefs, it's fun to be able to have all that creative power, and to be able to just make food look good, and to use that expression, to put some artistry into what you do. If you love something, you will find artistry in the work that you do. Oops, doubled up on that. But again, it's just like having fun with things, and just making food taste like where you are. This is a picture of cedar, rabbit, cranberries, wild rice, maple. You can literally stand in one spot in Minnesota and just glance around and see all those pieces right around you, And that's how we should be thinking about food. Like, what makes sense to us, And so we don't have to worry about food shortages from all over the world, We don't need those big box trucks of bringing things from all over the place with overprocessed foods. We could figure out what's around us, support local growers, harvesters. And so for us, we prioritize purchasing from Indigenous producers locally, then nationally, then we support BIPOC local, then we support just our local allies, and then we're buying organics at the bottom of that very list, And we have to support, just be intentional about why you're purchasing your food from where. And just make that a huge part of what you do as much as you can. And we should be intentional like that everywhere. You're not just blindly purchasing foods because we don't know where those foods come from. Know your growers, know your suppliers, know where it's coming from. And just keep food simple. It's that easy. What did you guys think of that little sample out there? How'd they do? Good. Because it's important that us as Indigenous peoples, that we're able to get this food to our communities. So it's too common right now that we don't see Indigenous foods in our celebrations, in our community centers, in our elder centers. That we need to make this more commonplace, and that's part of the work that we're working really hard with our group to try and help. So what we're trying to do is just reclaim Indigenous health and culture through food, and using food as the language. Food is a powerful language that we all have. And it's something that as Indigenous peoples and humans across the world, we all have in common. We all need food, And it helps open us up to think about other cultures, Just think about the first time you might have had some Vietnamese pho, or you might have had maybe some Ethiopian food, or whatever it might be. But it gives you a moment to really think about the culture that you're eating. And for us as Indigenous peoples to have the U.S. government spend so much time and effort trying to strip us from our cultures, we need to put that back so we can take this time to reclaim. We can take this time to reinvent who we are as Indigenous peoples and how our foods represent us, We don't have to cook exactly like our ancestors. We can modernize it. We can move it forward. We can do whatever we want to. You can have fry bread out there. It doesn't matter. You just have to decide as Indigenous peoples what is your representation of the foods moving forward. You have that power to recreate right now today, and you should hold that power. You should move forward with that power. And we can create businesses, where we can feature our own foods the way we want them perceived. Because I remember when we opened up Tatanka Truck a few years back, and we knew we weren't going to have any fry bread. I didn't know if we were just going to piss off every native in the whole state, or how it was going to go. But it turned out to be good. It turned out people were happy that we cut out colonial ingredients. We didn't serve any dairy or wheat flour or cane sugar or even beef, pork, or chicken. We were just really focused on trying to represent what is a modern view of Indigenous foods in the best way that we could. We didn't have to be perfect. We just had to at least try, and that's what it's about. So creating companies like the Sous Chef brand that I started in 2014, or our nonprofit that's here in Minnesota called Natives, which is North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. You might have been able to stop at the booth and talk to some of our staff out there. But our focus is just two pillars: creating access to Indigenous education and creating access to Indigenous foods. And so it's using the two fronts that the U.S. government had against us by stripping our foods away from us, stripping our education away from us, and using those two pieces to help rebuild us, to help make us stronger as Indigenous peoples. So the work that we're doing at Indigenous Food Lab in Minneapolis is really, we have this really broad vision of how we can help, So what we're doing is just first off understanding teaching people the benefits of indigenous diets, which are more access to healthy fats, diverse proteins, low carbs, low salts, lots of plant diversity, so much more than the Western diet. Organic agriculture, celebrating cultural and regional diversities, and just understanding how regional and seasonal-based food systems work, and how we can harvest things in the short windows that things are ready to be harvested and preserve them so we can hold on to them for the year. And so much amazing food ideas and products can come out of that. People can create all sorts of wonderful indigenous food businesses just by understanding like how to harvest things naturally, how to set up the world around us better to do that. Because we all need to work towards indigenous food sovereignty for ourselves, but we have to understand those pieces, that we need healthy food access, we need cultural producers, we need regional food systems, and we need our own local control of our food systems, not governmental control. That's a really important piece right there, that we need to reclaim the power of our own food systems. Like, we have to monitor it ourselves. Access to indigenous education is extremely important because that's our knowledge base, that's where our values come from. And understanding that why we need environmental protections, because we cannot trust the US government to protect our land spaces for us. And if you look at the statistics of land ownership today, it's still 98% white European owned of all privately owned land across the United States, which is a direct result of the very recent colonial history that we've all just been through. But we need to push for more community gardens, more permacultural landscapes, and I always say this at my talks, but lawns are fucking stupid. We need to spend all of our time putting food everywhere, absolutely everywhere we possibly can. We have the ability to do that. We can just plant how we want to. We should just be putting food that's natural to our area everywhere, not ornamentals, but food, And think about it. A lot of the things they call ornamentals are food. If you're out in California and you say like, oh, where can I harvest some manzanita? Most people will be like, I don't know what that is. You're like, oh, it's that red tree. It's like, oh yeah, I see that everywhere, Like, we don't have the connections to those food sources, but we need to. We just need to put food everywhere. But we also need to be able to train professional kitchens on how to harvest this food. Like, if you've ever been in the backs of these casinos and they have so much amazing kitchen resources and culinary teams, but we need that for our communities because food is the center of everything for us. It's the one thing that we need every day, so we should be putting our resources into food, right? And so we need highly trained people to be able to process some of our foods very safely, because some of our recipes are tricky, especially when we get into fermenting some things, harvesting some wild things, knowing the right pieces, and just knowing how to carefully do it to retain nutrition and flavor. So that's a big part of what we're trying to do with our nonprofit, is to help train modern indigenous culinary moving forward, Because if we can control our food, we can control our future, because that's how our ancestors survived for multiple generations and millennia. And it's important that we take the time to just really think about and make our own education, Take the time to create what is indigenous education, break that down. We need more and more indigenous educators working on that out there, because we just need more resources for indigenous education, again, on a pan-indigenous scale, because we can all learn from each other. The last thing white supremacy wants is for all indigenous peoples from around the world to get together to stand up against that piece, but we can do that. We have that power to move forward. Our vision with the Indigenous Food Lab is, right now we're in Minneapolis, but we're going to work on extensions and start moving them around. So right now we're actively looking at Anchorage, Alaska, Bozeman, Montana, Chicago, and Rapid City, South Dakota as first extension spaces. In each one of those, thank you. Each one of those spaces will be a place where we can just be another regional center point. We can be all over the nation, and we can cross colonial borders because they don't mean anything to us. We can be down in Mexico, up in Canada, over in Africa or India or South America, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, wherever. We can open up these development centers because we're just trying to create a support center out there. We just want to help support more indigenous culinary so we can help people if they need business development, if they need to work on business plans or find funding or understanding how all those numbers work, or find spaces or train. Like, we can train people here in the cities, and we're already working on that. We've already been bringing people in and having them train in the food lab, in the restaurant, and using those spaces as live on-the-job training spaces to see how we can do this in real time. And we just really want to help support and develop more opportunities so we can see more indigenous food production. Like our purchasing power is just getting bigger and bigger as we're growing all these businesses and getting more indigenous foods out there. I think I just bought like 1,200 pounds of rice from a young couple in northern Minnesota. I just bought like another 1,000 pounds of Potawatomi corn. We're getting corn from the Southwest. We're getting corn from all over the place, you know, and we're just opening up because these businesses can spur that, like they can help develop all these pieces, you know. And Owamni's been a really important part of this. So I'm really glad for some of you who were able to get to Owamni last night. But again, for us, this restaurant's not about me as a chef. It's not about even our team. It's just about doing something different. You know, it's about setting the tone for what's possible. That we could have a restaurant that doesn't have any dairy or flour or sugar. We don't even have any black pepper. We don't have ketchup. We don't have ranch dressing. So sorry, but we have a lot of great stuff, you know, and we can be really creative moving forward. And we can take the time to really reclaim where we are, to take the time to, you know, take those steps to tell the stories through indigenous lenses. And just know that, you know, we can get this back out there to the community because we have to. Like, we have too many bad statistics out there as indigenous communities, and it's a direct result of the food. So we need to change the food right now, and it's possible today. Again, we have to prioritize purchasing from indigenous producers to help build that. We need more distribution. We need more foods out there. And we can use chefs. There's so many creative people out there. We can come up with all sorts of wonderful things. Try cooking dessert without dairy, flour, or sugar, you know? But we've been able to play with it long enough where it's easy. We can think of all sorts of wonderful situations, you know? So we really believe that the future is indigenous and that we can all get there, but we have to do it together. You know, our goal is to make ourselves healthy, to be surrounded by our ancestors' education, our ancestors' foods, and have access to that so we can put that into our bodies, into our minds, and into our souls. We need it today, you know. So that's why for us, this is an indigenous evolution and revolution at the same time, but we can all do it together.